So a quick introduction to this event. The US-China trade war has shaken up many of the industries that enjoyed large and successful businesses between the US and China over the past several decades. The US is poised to fundamentally reevaluate its trade relationship with China, especially regarding industries deemed key to US interests. For this reason, YCW has invited two experts in US-China trade to comment on what the new normal might look like when we normalize trade relations with China. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Anna Ashton. Anna began her tenure at the US-China Business Council in January 2016. Since August 2019, she has served as the Senior Director of Government Affairs, developing and implementing USCBC's advocacy on behalf of member companies. She previously served as the Director of Business Advisory Services, leading staff across USCBC's 3 offices in providing member companies with analysis of China's commercial policies, business operating environment, and best practices. Anna regularly speaks at programs for business and policy audiences. She has appeared in a range of broadcast media such as Bloomberg, Yahoo Finance, CGTN, BBC, NPR, CNBC, and Fox Business. She also provides on-the-record and on-background perspectives on US-China issues for publications including Newsweek, the South China Morning Post, Barron's, Voice of America, and Inside US Trade. Previous to working at the US-China Business Council, Anna served as China analyst in both public and private sector positions. She began her career as an intelligence officer for the Department of Defense, where she prepared intelligence briefings for the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and top military officials. Welcome, Anna. It's great to have you. And our second speaker, a surprise late addition we're very happy to have, is Jacob Parker. Jacob is Senior Vice President at the US-China Business Council. In this role in Washington, he manages USCBC's China operations as well as the analysis and advocacy work in both countries. Prior to his current position, he held progressively responsible roles in the Council's Beijing and Shanghai offices. Jacob has worked on a variety of international public and private projects throughout his career. Before joining USCBC, Jacob worked as a program manager at Philips Healthcare, where he oversaw implementation of XLM Bank, Nordic Investment Bank, and Ashra Bank international government loan projects for developing medical infrastructure in China. And prior to that, as the Director of Operations at the USA Pavilion Shanghai Expo, Jacob was responsible for the setup, maintenance, and general operation of the pavilion, and for sharing American culture and values with more than 7 million visitors during the 6 months of operation. So welcome, Jacob. It's good to have you as well. And okay, now that we're through the basic logistics, we're going to go through a couple of prepared questions we have for the speakers. It's going to be a casual fireside chat format, and we're definitely going to leave at least 20 to 30 minutes for your questions as well. So please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom. Without further ado, let's get started. So the first question we have on our list is just to kind of set the general context and stage. What are some of the biggest changes that will come from the current trade war in terms of how business will be done between the US and China, comparing the period 1990 to 2020, which maybe was sort of a golden age after the original opening up of China after Deng Xiaoping, to 2020 and beyond? And either of you would like to go first on that one? Anna?
Sure. Sorry, I have a Christmas movie going on nearby. Yeah, I'm happy to get started, and really glad that Jake agreed that he would join tonight too, because we both have significant backgrounds working on business advocacy in the US-China space, but from very different aims. He was on the ground in China for a very long time, which is not something that I've really done in my career. So hopefully together we'll be able to give you well-rounded perspective that we couldn't provide alone. So I'll kick off with this question. We kind of divvied up the questions based on who we thought could answer them best, but I'm sure he will have some insights on this one. So basically, we're at the beginning of a new chapter in the US-China relationship. It's not just about trade, but about the relationship more broadly. For the past 3 or so years, we've been at the beginning of a strategic shift, and that reevaluation and reorientation of our relationship with China is going to continue under a Biden administration, though it will likely look a little bit different. Disruption and change in the relationship were coming, regardless of whether President Trump had won the 2016 election. The status quo in 2016 was deeply unpopular in its own right. The business community wasn't particularly happy with the trajectory of the relationship and the pace of of economic reform and opening up. During that year's presidential campaign, both Trump and Clinton's rhetoric made clear that a departure from business as usual was on the agenda. But the strategic shift that we're currently undergoing really was precipitated by the Trump administration's new approach to the trade relationship. And though we can debate the merits of how the Trump administration handled China policy, Trump will likely be credited with kicking off a shift that is overwhelmingly viewed by both Democrats and Republicans in Washington as both overdue and necessary. President Trump ran in 2016 on a promise of rebalancing our trade ties and making that aspect of the relationship more fair and more beneficial for Americans. And his administration really didn't wait too long to pursue that goal by levying high tariffs on virtually everything China exports to the United States. The Trump administration also ended the longstanding bilateral dialogues and other mechanisms for engagement that had been fundamental to our diplomatic relationship for decades. In many ways, this was an intentionally disruptive shakeup, but it also created unwelcome unpredictability and uncertainty for businesses on both sides, and pertaining to non-business issues as well. Under a Biden administration, really no one should expect a return to the old status quo. The disruption, the shift, the reorientation, renegotiation of the relationship, however you want to describe it, it's going to continue. Biden's rhetoric during the 2020 presidential election was really just as tough as Trump's, but the Biden campaign has heavily emphasized a desire to leverage multilateral cooperation much more aggressively in approaching China challenges. So the difference will likely be in style and execution more so than in fundamental views. Biden will likely attempt a hard reset of the Trump administration's go it alone, America first style, but he will be constrained by domestic pressures because support for protectionist policies, distrust of globalism, these are real trends in public perceptions and in the views of elected officials in both parties. There was a Pew poll that was released earlier this year that showed that 72% of Americans hold a negative view of China, the most negative in 15 years of Pew doing this polling, and a 20% increase over the last 4 years. And stats on China-related bills and resolutions in Congress bear out that this is reflected in Washington too. There are, to date, 489 by our count, bills and resolutions that have a China angle and are in some way meant to address China challenges or contain China. And that is really unheard of and unprecedented for legislation on any given topic. So an example that we like to draw is that after September 11th, 2001, in the 107th Congress, there were about 130 bills and resolutions proposed that had a counterterrorism angle to them. So 130 counterterror related bills and resolutions right after the attacks of 9/11, 489 China related resolutions right now. Huge difference, and it really speaks to the extent of like the zeitgeist and angst over China in Washington. I think that there's reason to hope that in the next 4 years, we will begin to see a new, more carefully crafted and comprehensive strategy towards China begin to take shape. But despite, really strong bipartisan support for a comprehensive reassessment and recalibration of the relationship, there really are sharp differences emerging over exactly how adversarial the relationship has to be and what that's going to mean for specific policy priorities and choices. Are there areas where we can work together and cooperate or not? Are those areas going to be priorities, or is decoupling going to sort of override that? It could easily take, I think, more than this next presidential administration to sort out our priorities and sort of set ourselves on a clear course with US policy in the 21st century. And even if we do achieve it in the near term, I think it'll probably be buffeted by events and developments that require additional adjustments over time. And I will let Jake take the next question or add to that.
Anything you wanted to add to that, Jake?
No, I think that was really comprehensive and gets to right at the core of the issue. I mean, we can address more of these things in the Q&A as questions come in as well. But I think that was a great answer.
I agree. It really sets the context for, as Anna was saying, sort of where the zeitgeist is, and then quantifying it in terms of just the sheer amount of legislation that's addressing it. So to get a little bit more specific now, a question for you, Jake. With some industries considered national security priorities on both sides, both China and the U.S., is there going to be a bifurcation long-term in cross-border trade for those industries where it could be decades or who knows how long before there would be allowed to be trade in them? Some examples being 5G. We've seen Huawei come under fire, cloud infrastructure, AI technology, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's already happening. When we talk to our member companies on the ground, they indicate they're already creating a different tech infrastructure in China than they are in the United States. A big part of that is China's policy direction, its data localization regime, its information communication technology requirements, its government procurement requirements in certain sectors and industries. So there is a bit of a shift that's happening currently. However, I think it's unlikely that we'll ever see these industries completely cut off in the long term, just because global ecosystems are the way that they are. And if we look at a Biden administration and any administration after it, I think that we can fairly assess that technology competition with China is undoubtedly going to continue in the future. And so those frictions will always be there. I would anticipate a more strategic and like-minded aligned policy prescription to achieve the goals of what we call internally supply chain resilience, and what folks in Washington, D.C. Call supply chain resilience, or the idea that if there was ever some kind of major disruption like COVID-19 with personal protective equipment, the United States would be able to maintain its supply chain and its supply of critical and strategic products. I wanted to talk a little bit just about 5G specifically and about Huawei specifically. So we can examine kind of the successes and the failures of the Trump administration's strategy and tactics that will also give us some guidance on what kind of actions we might be able to expect in the future. So May 2019, Huawei was added to the entity list. Most companies halted sales immediately, most of our members, examining their supply chains, seeing what they could and could not sell to Huawei. The entity list, as probably someone this phone call are aware, has two main features, but it's imperfect for restricting completely the sale of products to a company that's added to it. The first is called the Foreign Direct Product Rule. What this does is it's intended to capture items manufactured outside of the United States that use products that are made in the U.S. and controlled for export control reasons. The second is the de minimis rule. So if an item has more than 25% American controlled content, it can't be sold. Now, the problem with that is that many of our companies have global production systems and ecosystems, and they can usually shift their production outside of the United States for critical components and continue the sale to a company. And again, this is completely 100% legal. There's nothing sketchy about it at all. It's just the way that the rules work, and shows the blunt object at which the entity list is. And there were three repercussions from this action. The first is that it immediately sparked a frenetic effort to diversify away from American-made products and services on the ground in China, because the United States was not aligned with its allies. Japan, Korea, European companies were happy to begin capturing American market share and sell to Huawei. Second, within weeks, companies resumed sales to Huawei because they could legally do so, because the above rules have certain gaps that they can sell through. And third, the entity listing of Huawei also prohibited American companies from engaging in any kind of international standard setting processes with Huawei, which effectively for a year and a half kept American firms out of the critical international standard setting organizations that were working on 5G, that were working on clear band communications, and a variety of other standards that are out there at the moment. You can probably see why this tactic has been a failure. One, it didn't achieve its policy goal. American companies kept legally selling to Huawei. Second, in the rare case of a company not selling to Huawei, it forced a competitor, or it allowed a competitor to step in and sell whatever the American company could not. So there wasn't that coordinated effort of trying to restrict other companies from other countries stepping in to fill that void. And third, it's completely changed the perception on the reliability of American companies and encouraged many Chinese companies to shift their production to alternative suppliers. Now, why is that important? Profits are important because sales that keep American companies more profitable than their rivals ensure that they are able to reinvest those profits that they make abroad in research and development initiatives that allow them to stay on the cutting edge of technology development. And as many of you who are in Silicon Valley know, you have to make those investments. It's usually 10 years out before they bear fruit. So the consequences of this action are not going to be seen for a decade or more, that this shift is happening away from American companies. So this is a long-winded way of making a specific point, is that much has been learned under the Trump administration, and that these tactics will be refined in the future to help meet these strategic ends. I think that the next stage of technology restrictions and supply chain resilience will focus on building multilateral coalitions with American allies, Japan, the European Union in particular, that will coordinate restricting strategic technologies. That will be significantly more successful in curtailing the flow of technologies to China, while also using the initial policy priority of the Trump administration, which was cutting off what we call the choke point technologies to certain Chinese companies. And the United States is particularly strong in semiconductor manufacturing technologies, semiconductor capital equipment manufacturing, as well as the design softwares that are used to produce the schematics for semiconductors. So focusing on those key areas, I think, is one thing that you'll continue to see going forward. From China, it'll be interesting to see. I think that enhancing the resilience of strategically important supply chains will also focus on understanding American manufacturing vulnerabilities and reducing the concentration of strategic manufacturing in the China market, particularly in telecom, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, rare earths, and personal protective equipment. We expect to see supply chain audits in the new administration that would understand the degree of reliance on China in strategic sectors and identify alternative supply and allied country markets. We may also begin to see some probing and testing of supply chains to see how resilient they would be during sustained shocks. And while the Trump administration was very focused on exclusively relocating supply chains to the United States, realistically, that's not feasible in all cases. So we expect the new administration to begin supporting the shift of strategic manufacturing just to other allied and aligned markets to ensure that there's a stable supply of those strategic products going forward. Maybe I can just stop there. Thanks.
No, that's great. That's a very thorough answer. And I think it kind of, I already see one of the first questions that came in is about sort of the Biden administration approach to it and coordinating with the allies and how that could really shift the effectiveness of trying to shut off trade in strategic industries. On sort of the flip side of that, what industries are most likely to remain strongly positioned to enter the China market and vice versa? So, Chinese companies that could still come to the US freely and that we see, think that could actually grow in the next couple of years.
Let me talk a little bit, maybe I can just talk a little bit about some of the export industries where in the United States we're going to continue to be really strong in the decades ahead. There's really good promise for increased exports of US agricultural commodities to China. China's ratio of arable land to people does not currently allow it to be self-sufficient and a producer of foodstuffs. So that's why agriculture, food security is such an important thing on the ground in China. Agricultural exports have dropped considerably during the trade conflict, with China's retaliatory tariffs on U.S. agriculture products. It's obviously led to a shift of Chinese purchasing to Brazil, Poland, and other markets. But the Phase 1 agreement has increased some of those numbers a little bit, as we've seen over the last year. Agriculture has been a bright spot, while petroleum, oil, some of the manufactured goods have been a little softer. Ag is kind of beating all the expectations. Energy is another for similar reasons. The U.S. is essentially an energy independent country now and is able to obviously sell more crude and oil to the China market. I think commodities look good. The area that I find really interesting is Chinese investing in the United States. And the recent numbers, frankly, are absolutely abysmal. If you compared, I think, 2015 to today, be something like 60 billion in new investment that year, and today it's like 3 billion. And I've got those numbers totally wrong, but folks will hopefully forgive me. I'm just trying to make a comparison. For a Chinese company to successfully invest in the United States, it needs to fall in a tricky Venn diagram of 3 different circles. The first circle is the Chinese company desires, right? And historically, those desires have been focused primarily on what I would call vanity assets, football teams, real estate projects. Look at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. We wouldn't consider necessarily to be the most business-friendly investments or return-driven investments. And that's one Venn diagram circle. The second is U.S. industry desires, right? And I think in that, or I should say maybe state government desires. And in that circle, I would say that any greenfield investment that a Chinese investor wants to make in the United States is almost always going to be welcomed locally. Car manufacturing, it doesn't matter. It's all going to be welcome. However, what is not welcome and will never be welcome again in the United States is Chinese acquisitions of strategic technologies. Syngenta was probably, frankly, the last technology company with any kind of serious strategic technology that will be acquired by a Chinese firm. That's just not something that's on the table anymore. And the third Venn diagram circle is what the Chinese government views as a good allocation of state capital. And what the Chinese government views as a good allocation of state capital is technology, it's industries where China can take intellectual property back to China, re-engineer it, repurpose it, and develop new technologies there. And so you can imagine within those Venn diagram circles, the overlap is increasingly small, which I would argue is why so little investment is coming to the United States today compared to 6 years ago, when at least the Chinese government piece of that and the US piece of that had slightly larger circumferences that overlapped.
So I'm kind of jumping ahead to another question here because you've already started to touch on it with, we had a question about the CFIUS controls and what, this Venn diagram is going to look like. Given that we have, an audience from tech, do you think most of the tech industry should just sort of not waste their time, especially now before trade relations are normalized, to try to raise money from China?
I wouldn't waste my time.
Yeah, right. Okay. Simple answer. So we're looping back to a subject that we already touched on, talking about how the Biden administration is going to take a multilateral approach to China. So this question is, do you think pressure from China to abide by global trade standards will come from regions other than the US? So if Biden goes out seeking support abroad, will there be an appetite to do that? And given the context that you brought up, where some of these other countries seek to gain from the US being isolated in confronting China, do you think they will sort of give up those gains and create a new unified front?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, because I think it's fair to say that our European allies and trading partners are hopeful that there will be a change in tone in our trade relationships with them, that there will be, a rollback of some of the tariffs that we've levied against them, and that we will be, I guess, from their perspective, more constructive and cooperative in addressing our trade challenges across the Atlantic. And there also has always been a lot of common ground between our European trading partners, Canada, Australia, and many other nations, and us, and our perspectives about the challenges that China poses. China, I think, has done a good job for a really long time of kind of dividing and conquering, especially between the US and Europe. They, seem to, for a long time, they've been studying not just international law and learning how to leverage it in international forums, which I think, when they joined the WTO, they were at a bit of a disadvantage, but they quickly overcame that and have gotten very savvy. But also, there are all sorts of interesting cases of Chinese plaintiffs bringing claims in domestic courts in the United States and in Europe, and kind of influencing changes in the laws there in these different countries, in ways that forward China's commercial and policy goals, and oftentimes kind of further splits in terms of perspectives on various trade issues between the United States and Europe. I think that despite the fact that we have lots of common interests, we also have these critical areas that that we need to work together on, but that are new in terms of trade disciplines that aren't really, that we don't have an agreement on in terms of how we're going to regulate them. And a huge one is in the tech space and with data and just internet governance in general. And I do wonder, you know, even if there is will, lots of goodwill to try to work together on that, how easy will it be? And probably a lot of people who are on the call now have more educated guesses about that than I do. But I also wanted to answer this question that came from an audience member about what do we think that the Biden administration will do faced with closer integration of America's trade partners with China, with the recent regional comprehensive economic partnership, and given some of the anti-globalization sentiments in America, what do we think the Biden administration will do to foster globalization and free trade while also keeping voters happy? Because I think, you know, this also gets to the prospects for multilateral work and the importance of multilateral work. You know, China is promoting its own rules and norms internationally, and frankly, it has every right to, even if we disagree with them. It's just concluded the RCEP agreement, which is the largest trading bloc globally, covering a market of 2.2 billion people and $26.2 trillion worth of global output. That's roughly 30% of global GDP. You know, there are critics who say that the agreement's not very deep, but the reality is that it does facilitate trade in a really critical way between Asia Pacific countries that are also our trading partners. And the basis of that trade facilitation is not necessarily our preferred rules and norms. And at the same time, you know, there's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the version of the TPP that was solidified after we backed out of it in 2016, which we're not a party to. That's another Asia Pacific trade agreement that facilitates trade between nations that we rely on trade with, and that we're not participating in, and that China has expressed an explicit interest in joining. It's really important for us to figure out how we're going to assert ourselves in the Asia Pacific, how we're going to maintain trade relations that work for us there. And I think that the Biden administration, I know that during the campaign, the Biden campaign talked about the possibility of rejoining TPP, and I have to imagine that that's a real live interest for them. But I think it will be a challenging thing to accomplish, and there will be some congressional politics that may play a role. So the Democrats on the Hill have been very, very clear that they're not interested in moving forward with any more free trade agreements, unless those agreements have pretty strong chapters that address climate change and also labor rights. Republicans in Congress don't have a very strong history of being willing to support language that is proposed by Democrats on those subjects. They did manage to work out an agreement that got some of that stuff into the renegotiated North America trade agreement, but that will be a real challenge if Democrats control the House and Republicans control the Senate. Likewise, if Democrats control the House and Democrats control the Senate, our trading partners may find themselves unable to come to the table and sign an agreement that we're willing to approve. So there are some real domestic challenges for pursuing greater multilateral engagement, for reasserting ourselves in the Asia Pacific, for building bridges with Europe towards further cooperation and like-minded efforts to address challenges with China. I think Biden is an experienced diplomat with experienced diplomats around him, and probably is bringing lots of good ideas to the table for how to forge a path in this direction. But I think there are going to be a lot of obstacles.
All right, thank you. Shifting back to the China policy side, and this is a question for Jake. So a big sticking point in a lot of the trade war has been China's use of subsidies in their own domestic industries, and it's been a core part of their own sort of domestic development strategy for a long time. And U.S. industries were sort of accuse them of being anti-competitive in that sense. Do you think China would ever, if and we just heard from Anna how difficult it would be to create a united front in some of these alliances, but assuming we could, is there any amount of pressure that would make China move away from that strategy of using subsidies for domestic development?
It's a good question. I think our position at the U.S.-China Business Council is not that we should try to convince China not to use subsidies. Every country uses subsidies. Every country has industrial policies. They call it by a different name. I think what the business community is hopeful for is instead that China would be a bit more transparent in how its industrial policies were deploying capital, ensure that American companies or all companies that are operating in the market would be able to access that capital, and just to make sure that when an industry is suffering from overcapacity, which is the dark side of industrial policies, as we saw with solar panels. Effectively, China's subsidies in the solar industry have driven every American solar producer out of the market, many in Europe as well. So those are the challenges that subsidies can create in distorting competitive markets. We're not looking to have China eliminate all their industrial policies. That's not a reasonable goal, but we are hoping that they can be more transparent, ensure there's easier access for everyone who's involved, and to stop subsidizing when industries are heating up and overcapacity takes hold.
So to kind of follow up on that question, if China doesn't have an agreement to put some measures in place for when a market might be overheating, do you think those are ones that the international community might cut off and say, we can't trade in those markets? We don't want entire industries to be wiped out anymore when there's overproduction?
China is sensitive to overcapacity. They've already taken measures against the industrial overcapacity and historic industries, steel, aluminum, cement. Here's the challenge. When we look at something like the export controls or the actions taken by U.S. industry and potentially in the future international industry to try and restrict the flow of certain technologies to China, what that does is it convinces China that it can't rely on anyone outside of China. It doubles down on its strategy of developing that technology domestically. It shifts away from the purchases of foreign technology and it engineers its own. So the actions that we take in trying to restrict these technologies, they have serious repercussions which undermine our strategic priorities in areas like reducing China's industrial policies. So we can continue to argue and complain. I was with the minister of MIIT, which is an industrial regulator in China once, and he made a point that I thought was very logical and accurate. He said, look, if you won't sell us technology, then we can either make it at home, we can buy it from someone else, or, and he kind of left this out, well, we can steal it, right? So there's dark sides to kind of this restriction game that create upticks in other areas we might not like.
Yep. No, it's a good point, and you have to be realistic about it. So coming up on one of the last of the questions we had prepared here, and this one I kind of joking was a selfish question for myself, but also representing the Young China Watchers chapter here. So for, what would you tell young professionals interested in careers related to cross-border trade? And I know that's a very wide, territory. I'm thinking more, representing our San Francisco chapter, those that might be interested in cross-border tech or kind of tech-related industries that previously had ambitions to expand into China. Do you think tech is one you should kind of stay away and it's kind of unrealistic or too unstable to think of as having realistic chance to expand into China? And if not tech, are there particular industries in the long term, other than agriculture, which I know you already flagged as one that China is going to have a large appetite for exports from the US? Are there any other industries you think those that are interested in a cross-border career should think about pursuing?
Anna, do you want to try to take that one?
I'll give a few thoughts. I do think that cross-border tech careers with China are going to be more challenging than they might have been if we had remained on the trajectory we were on before this major shift in the relationship. But by the same token, I think that having that set of expertise and that knowledge, tech industry knowledge, is going to be so marketable, critical, and crucial to navigating the U.S.-China relationship in the 21st century. We're not, I think, Jake said this earlier, we're not going to be able to completely decouple from each other and not engage with each other. It's just not realistic. And we're going to have a lot of tricky questions to figure out about how exactly you strike the right balance between ensuring that we're looking after our national security interests and at the same time not undermining our competitiveness. And we're really going to need subject matter experts who can guide us in doing that. So tech experts in Silicon Valley who want to move to DC, I think will have lots of opportunities.
And maybe I can offer just two additional thoughts to that. One is, if you have a skill that's needed in the United States or China, I think you can continue to work between the countries. If you're a terrific coder, if you're a terrific CFO, if you have some kind of a supply chain manager, if you have some very specific skill that's needed in China, I think there's lots of opportunities still between the two countries. The other area that I would note is, when you think about the technologies that will continue to be successful in China, or industries that will continue to be successful in China, they're ones where they're at the bleeding edge of technological development, where there's limited to no domestic Chinese competition. And there remain spots like that, certainly among our members today. Genetic sequencing, for example, the high-end server business, high-end medical devices, 300 slice CT scanner and above, or some of the very high-end MR scanners. Now, when I was in the healthcare industry more than 10 years ago, we were still selling ultrasounds and X-ray machines. That market doesn't exist anymore. Chinese companies have just become too good. They've developed their own technology, good, innovative, solid technology that now competes at a much more competitive price, and frankly provides a superior product in some instances. So as long as you're at that peak of the technological value chain, there's going to continue to be opportunities in China as well, across industries.
Yep, makes sense. Thank you. And we have one other question. I encourage other attendees, if they have any questions now, we're kind of to the open portion now. We have a question from Charlie. Can you speak to the practicality and potential of the dual circulation economic model and the possible shortfalls in this effort? I'm not 100% sure. Are you familiar with that term?
Well,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So dual circulation. Is it okay if I take this one there or give it a shot?
I was just going to unmute to tell you to.
Yeah, we just had our board of directors trip to China. We met with the vice premier, a number of ministers. Dual circulation was the word of the day. Dual circulation, the way that it was explained to us is there's two circulars, right? There's the domestic circular where products and cycles are being shifted around the China market domestically. Then there's the international circular where everything goes to and from China, so the international trade piece. And the dual circulation system is marrying those two. Now, if you dig a little bit deeper, what it certainly looks like is it's an effort to develop self-reliance in certain critical and key technologies. I've been working with Chinese government officials for many years. I had always believed, if you would have asked me 2 years ago, whether China had a domestic consensus on localization and self-reliance, I would have said no. I would have said there's obviously voices that are pushing for that supply chain resilience, what we call it in the US, what they call self-reliance, but there wasn't a consensus. That is over and done. There's now a complete 100% consensus in China that they need to ensure that they can move up the industrial value chain, and they need not rely on the United States or any other foreign party to support them in that technological development effort. As a result, the dual circulation system, in my mind, is an effort to shift away strategically and over the medium term from American and foreign technologies. That means more industrial subsidies. That means more support. That means a lot of different measures to ensure that using government procurement, the Chinese companies are able to have the resources they need to develop the technologies that China currently doesn't excel in. I think it's frankly a little bit concerning. But again, that's a response to some of the policy actions that we've seen out of the Trump administration. So this didn't happen in a vacuum. And that's just something we have to recognize as well.
Did you want to add to that, Anna? No. Okay. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Any other closing statements from the speakers? No need to have one if you didn't have one prepared. Just wanted to give you one more chance.
I just really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, and welcome interactions with anybody who's on the line going forward. Please feel free to reach out to us, and we're always interested in new perspectives ourselves, and I'm sure that you have perspectives that would help us better understand aspects of the relationship. So
great.
Indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, and I speak on behalf of Young China Watchers and all the attendees. We really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us, especially at a later hour on the East Coast. Now, with the relationship as fraught as it is, and we were talking about a statistic with, less US students studying Chinese than previously, and, the negative sentiment going up, it matters more than ever to have these kind of events and build understanding. So we really appreciate it. Thank you. And to all of our attendees, thank you for coming.